Hey everybody, just a quick reminder before we get the episode going that your support means a great deal to me. If you are able to support the channel financially, please do go to 10percenttrue.com, hit subscribe and pick one of the packages. For £5, $6.50 a month, you get early access and ad-free access to my content. And for a little bit more than even that, you also get access to AMA and private Q&A sessions that are run directly with my guests through Zoom call at least once a quarter, probably more often than that. I'd appreciate your support. Anyway, let's get on with the episode. Shamu, welcome to 10% True. Great to see you.
Hey, Steve. Thank you for having me on there.
So, Shamu, we are going to talk about F-15 today. There's the channel, 10% True, has had a number of episodes. We've done a number of episodes on the F-15, Strike Eagle, Eagle, Early Day Eagle, Later Day Eagle. And interestingly, you spent 20 years flying the F-15, so we'll cover all of it, I think, in the course of our conversation today. You started flying the A model, I think, and then you went all the way through to the V2 ASA radar up at Elmendorf in Alaska. And I'm very excited to hear you tell the story of how that happened. Do you want to give us a quick introduction? Let us know who you are and what your Air Force career broadly looked like.
Yes, I went to the United States Air Force Academy right out of high school. Graduated in 1982. Going to the Air Force Academy was really not my idea. It was my father's idea. He was very insistent that I apply to multiple of the academies. But once I got there, I did enjoy it. Coming out of there, I went straight to pilot training in Del Rio, Texas. And I stayed as a T-38 FAPE. I believe your audience is pretty familiar with a FAPE, first assignment instructor pilot. As a FAPE, I stayed actually not just the normal 3 years, but one extra year because I was very determined to try to have my best shot to get an F-15. And trying to, basically pad the resume, get more accomplishments, and be as competitive as possible because it's a very competitive environment. Leaving as an instructor from pilot training to get a fighter in particular, but an F-15 specifically. I was really, really lucky, and I did get the F-15C, which is exactly what I was hoping to do. From there, I went to all the trainings that you do. I think you've discussed that plenty with other previous guests, and we kind of know how that involves. And then from there, I went to the 48th Fighter Squadron at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And the 48th was actually one of 4 squadrons that was at Langley at the time. There were 3 squadrons up in the first fighter wing with a tactical fighter mission, and we actually had an air defense mission. Following that, I left and went down to Tindal to be an RTU instructor in the F-15. Probably one of my best assignments ever. That was pretty amazing time down there. And that was right around the time where the Gulf War was going on and the post-Gulf War stuff was going on. So that was an interesting time. And then following that, you normally have to do some time out of the cockpit in the United States Air Force. And my time out of the cockpit was in NORAD in the J5 planning staff. I was happy about that, not because I was out of the cockpit, but it was air-to-air related. So I felt like I was still contributing to the community. And that became fairly significant a few years later with the advent of 9/11. And so that was some insight that I had that was not everybody gets to have, involving why we had the posture that we did going into 9/11 on the air defense side. And then following that tour, I went up to Alaska. And Alaska was a great assignment, great place to fly, really good people. And not to mention that they were doing some very unusual and significant upgrades to the F-15 involving the V2 radar. So that was a neat experience as well. And thus, in my entire career, I kind of started with steam-driven F-15 A model radars with the little tiny computer. You have a larger computer probably on your watch right now than we had in the airplane. And then through the C model evolution, and then with MISSIP, and then finally ending with the V2 radar, which was a very eye-opening kind of a jump in the technology.
Wow. Well, I think, as I said, I'm very excited to get into that with you. I think it's always interesting when a guest sends some slides or some notes beforehand. And you did, and one
A
of the
little on the
things,
geeky side, yeah.
but the geeky side's awesome, and the audience in particular is very geeky. I think the audience wouldn't mind me saying that. They're like me. I mean, it's not a judgment. It's just it's who I am and it's who
Right.
they are. So I liked that you sent some some sort of pre-brief materials around the
Yeah.
differences between the A model radar, C model radar, and then the V2 AESA.
Right.
So I'm excited to get into that with you. I think it bodes well for that conversation. So, but before we do that, it's interesting. I had Fred Knowles, whose episode will have gone out by the time this goes out. He was an F-106 guy flying in the 48th Fighter Interceptor Squadron before I think TAC came in and started taking control of things, and before the transition to the Eagle. So or if the audience has not listened to Fred, they should go back and listen to him because he describes that air defense mission, I think, really well. And I wouldn't want to ask you, Shamu, to go through the same thing and say the same thing as him. But I would be really curious, if you're happy to do this, to pick up on what your introduction then to the air defense mission was at the 48th. And maybe if your mind can go that far back, to talk a little bit about what the A model, or the C model rather, was like in that role, what made it really well suited to the role, and if, I don't know whether or not you had still had any 106 guys still in the squadron when you were there. They'd all gone.
Hmm.
Okay. But any sort of ideas as to how things had changed between the 106 and the F-15 coming in to do that mission. So that's a very wide brief, rather than
Yeah, I
an
think I
actual
get it.
question. But
Right.
yes,
I think I understand the gist of the question, and I'll basically structure it this way. First off, when I got to the 48th, I really didn't know that the squadron had a mission different than any other F-15 squadron throughout the CAF, the Combat Air Forces. I just went to a squadron where they told me to go, and there it was. I did subsequently after that learn that basically one of the reasons that I was sent there was that the pilots that they put in the 48th on average had more flying experience of some kind. In my case, the T-38 time, we had like several weapons officers all at one time, a lot of people with high time in the airplane. And the reason for that was that we had to fly a lot in basically bad weather, because if at the time the Soviets were flying off the coast of the East Coast, we would go out to find them in pretty nasty weather, both for takeoff, for landing, and where we were chasing them down. So that was, I think, the structure on it, and part of why maybe military personnel center sent certain people to the squadron. In a way, it was a great blessing for me, being so new to the Eagle and just showing up wanting to be as best of a wingman as I can. But consequently, the instructor staff was really strong. The weapons school staff was strong. And I would learn later in my career that the leadership that we had was also exceptionally strong. And so it really was a good opportunity to get a very good foundation, even though we were clearly the redheaded stepchild on Langley Air Force Base. There was the first fighter wing, and they had all the newer technology. They had all of the press coverage, and when the war kicked off, they're the ones that were the first out of the chute, and hats off to them. They did a fantastic job. So consequently, and you may have played on some sports teams where you feel that you're going in as the underdog, so you try a little harder, you train a little harder, and if you ever can get one up on the bigger team, as it were, you feel pretty good about it. And that happened a couple of times for us in the 48th. But the culture that I went into had nothing to do with the 106. In fact, they didn't even talk about it. The culture that I went into, they clearly, in fact, although technically we were supposed to be called the Fighter Interceptor Squadron of FIZ, 48th FIZ, you never ever said that. I'm probably going to have to buy some beers just for having said that right now. But we were the 48th Fighter Squadron, period, dot. And that culture was put in place, at least when I initially got there, by a really, really good leader. His call sign was Frito. He was the DO at the time. And he hammered in that we were a F-15 squadron. We did everything according to the F-15 standards, particularly the weapons school standards. And that's it. Yes, we had the air defense mission, and it was a challenging environment in the following way. The squadrons up the street were called 21 PAA, primary aircraft assigned. I've heard you talk about that before. Ours was only 18 PAA, so we had a smaller squadron. 3 airplanes doesn't sound like much, but it's a lot on the schedule because you never actually have 18. You have some that are in maintenance, some that are doing other things, and so it's a smaller amount. In addition, kind of like you had the talk of the guys over in Europe with the alert commitment, particularly the guys at Schusterberg. We also had an alert commitment, which is going to take a minimum of 3, but probably 4 jets off of your schedule to do that commitment 24/7, 365. It's always there, and it is your number one priority for a squadron that has an air defense mission. So consequently, your training assets are more limited. So you really have to squeeze every ounce of blood out of the turnip that you can when you're doing your training. And they did a really, really good job with it. So that's kind of the environment. Nothing to do with the 106. It was almost history that we just intentionally didn't talk about. Very, very concentrating on being the best Eagle squadron we could be. And then the air defense mission was always there. And our goal with that one, truthfully, was perfection. No screw ups, no buffoonery. And, you know, yes, there always was. And people have call signs because of it and all that. But, you know, that was the goal. And the leadership did a nice job of doing that. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it's certainly a good starting point.
Okay, great.
So tell me a little bit then about when you say the other 3 squadrons have more of a tactical role, you are more air defense. Obviously, we know you're out there to intercept threat aircraft, adversary aircraft that are potentially are threatening your the continental United States and airspace there within. But to my mind, that then conjures up the idea that they go out and do loads of BFM, and they're sort of, that's their thing. Whereas you guys are spending more time concentrating on long range intercepts, maybe that kind of thing. That's not the case.
No, that was at least not from my experience. Yes, your description of the air defense role is correct, of going out to find, and it could be anything from a distressed civilian pilot. It could be an airliner that's coded for some reason they're having an issue. But in our case, the more likely scenarios at that time were that the Soviet Union liked to kind of press to test and fly their Bear bombers sometimes along the East Coast. Sometimes they go down to Cuba, probably for a good TDY. But when they were doing that, we were needing to react. And that was all part of that giant NORAD structure with the Canadians and everything else. But that's what that was about. But that's not how we trained. We had to know how to do that, but we considered that almost like most normal squadron pilots would consider instrument flying. It's something you have to be good at. It's something you can't screw up, but that's not what you train to day to day. So our training program was pretty much identical to the one up the street that they did. And we trained in BFM, ACM, air combat training, or ACT, DACT, whenever we could get to it. We were very fortunate in that we had the Navy right across the bay down in Oceana. So we would fight. At that point, it was primarily the F-14. Occasionally, we'd have some F-18s that we could fly against. So our training program was very similar to theirs. The difference would be when they hit the books, they were more studying about, either their European commitment or their Middle East commitment. And we were studying kind of a generalized air-to-air commitment. But the way they ran the squadron, we did not focus, and we were not solely interceptor guys. It was a fighter squadron, period, dot. And we would prove that later on. I think I gave you kind of a preview in that there were some competitions that were air-to-air competitions among all the numbered air forces in the continental United States at that time. The guys from Europe were too far away to play in those. Same thing with the Pacific. So it's different from William Tell. But in those competitions, we did really, really well, even though we had the absolute oldest technology of anybody that was going into those competitions. And to me, what that taught me was that it's really about the squadron attitude. It's about the training. It's about the quality of your instructor pilots can really have a major benefit and effect on the competency of your squadron in general.
When you say then you had the oldest, are you saying you were flying pre-MISSIP C models?
No,
You were
we were
flying
flying pre-MISSIP A models. So
A's.
we had the old radars, I was trying to show you in the initial radar, the A model radar is a fantastic radar as compared to like the F4 and the F106 and the previous ones. It was, game changing as far as its increase in capability, but it definitely had some significant kind of little quirks that you had to work out in more of an analog fashion. And what I mean by that is, as the pilot, you need to know that in the A model, you're going to have certain blind zones where the processor he's running as fast as he can, but he's a little tiny computer. And every once in a while, he just can't process things. And there will be very specific times in the engagement timeline where the targets are going to disappear off your radar potentially because they're in what we called a blind zone. We knew where they were. And as the operator, you just kind of have to get patient, sit back, smoke a lucky, wait for him to pop out of the blind zone, then grab your sword and shoot and crank and do all that other neat stuff that all the Eagles were doing at the time. But the A model, those were some significant limitations that you had to live with as compared to the C models, which were down the street. They were not MISSIP at the time, if I remember correctly. That was too early. But they had what was called the PSP, Programmable Signal Processor, with about, and this is going to sound exceedingly small, but it was a 1 megabyte radar memory, if I remember correctly, as compared to ours, which was like 32K or 64K. It was, the Commodore computer that my kids were playing with at home had about the similar computing memory size as the airplane I was flying during the day. It was very, very good. I'm not denigrating it at all, but there were significant advances when they went to the larger memory, and specifically what was the programmable part was they could do radar tapes more rapidly and get upgraded technology in the airplane very quickly. That was much more difficult for the A model radar.
We'll get back into sort of radar geekery, I think, when we end up talking about V2. So we'll come back to this for the audience at home who are thinking, let's hear more about it. But you did mention DACT and you mentioned the F-14, which is always a subject that will trigger some people and create joy in others. Tell us a bit, or what is your memory about going up against the F-14 then? And of course, it's really important in the same way as when you talk about an F-15, as you've just demonstrated, you have to say, well, which F-15? Is it the A model? Is it, is it the pre-MISSIP? Is it MISSIP? What are you talking about? And it's the same with the F-14, with the old motors, the new motors, the AP-271, whatever. So what did you fly up against at Oceana? What kind of Tomcat were you flying against? And what are your thoughts on Phoenix? What are your thoughts on BFMing it? What recollections do you have?
Sure, absolutely. First off, it was really great fun to fly against them. They were really, really good people. They were good pilots. And the neat thing was, because of the proximity that we had to Oceana, many times what we would do was an out and back, in that we would take off, we would have pre-briefed with them and all that. We would brief, they would brief, we'd go over the water, we would fight. Then in many instances, more often we would land at Oceana because I think we had less requirements as far as getting back up off the ground. But we would land, we would debrief with them. When we were lucky, we actually were using the ACMI, the Air Combat Maneuvering Instrumentation ranges off the East Coast. So have a really good debrief with them, brief up again, go fly, fight, land separately, and then just do a phone debrief on the backside. The models that we flew were primarily against their older ones. They're the A for sure, but they had primarily the older engines. And so as far as a BFM machine, the Eagle was, clearly better. Yes, it still matters who's flying, and there are ways, but in general, particularly in our squadron, when you flew against the F-14A, you were expected in the BFM arena to win. I will say, I don't think that we gave as much credence as we should have to their long range radar threat with the Phoenix, mainly because there was nothing really replicating it in the threat airplanes that we would expect to go against in a war. So they would use them, but a lot of times, as far as like the kill criterion stuff, we didn't give it probably much respect as it should have had. But many of the instructors would absolutely have designed tactics where we would do, maneuvers at certain spaces in time on the intercept intentionally to try to defeat it, even if it wasn't going to quote unquote result in a kill on that particular training mission. But they did want us to be aware of that kind of a threat, kind of anticipating that at some point it was going to enter the inventory of a threat nation. We just didn't know when. It was excellent training. A lot of times they were also, we mainly were in support of or flying with their RTU. So many times, a lot of times we didn't know, but many times they were student sorties. And the way they would generally structure it is we were providing DACT support to them on a student sortie. It might be BFM, might be whatever. And then the other mission on the way home, let's say, would be in support of our training objectives. So there was a balance of give and take. It was a very good relationship. But as far as I was very, very happy that I was in the Eagle. Number one, I also didn't want to be in the Navy, so that made that decision a little bit easier. But they were good folks flying good airplanes, and I thought we really had an excellent relationship. I don't know where that developed, and I truthfully don't know if the first fighter wing had a similar relationship. I think they did, but I don't have specific knowledge of it. But the two bases being so close, even though we're from different services, everybody understood the value of DACT and tried to maximize their opportunity to get those kind of opportunities, and well worth it.
Let's talk about the air defense mission then a little.
Sure.
How many live intercepts did you do? What sort of recollections do you have about those?
Yeah, and live intercepts were relatively infrequent. The guys in the squadron, you were it was an unusual thing, and there were only a handful of guys that actually were launched on live bear missions. I was a couple of times, but many times, even though you're launched on them, they were so far out or staying so far away that you wouldn't necessarily get up on their wing. Like the Alaskan guys with their air defense, much more frequently, there's pictures of Alaskan tails, A-tails next to, at the time, Soviet, now Russian airplanes. It's still happening today. Off the East Coast, it was much less frequent, but because of the very, very important national infrastructure, command authority, all that stuff on the East Coast, that was just something that we were there to make sure they didn't take a right turn towards something of value. And we're actually transitioning down to Cuba for, cigars and nice tropical drinks. So there's only a few guys that actually got to see and do a bear. I went on several sorties when we were going to find them. It was interesting for me to listen to the description in one of your previous episodes about AWACS and the NATO AWACS and stuff. A lot of times on the CONUS side of it, we would work, I think, with guys that may have been in training. And there were some issues in the description that you had in the Northern Watch that sounded very familiar, where we were kind of wondering if it was better or worse. If you have a good AWACS, it was tremendous. If you had somebody not so good, it may be more degrading than helpful. But we would chase them when we could. I was never one that actually got to go on the wing of a bear, and only a few guys in the squadron did.
The 106 obviously had the SAGE air to ground, ground to air rather, network system, so they could receive target data direct to the cockpit. In fact, from what Fred was saying, they could even fly the aeroplane for you to get you into the right intercept geometry. You're going to talk, hopefully, about when we get to the Alaska part of your career, you're going to talk about FIDL, Final Data Link. But at this point, were you using JTIDs? I know that some...
We did not. A models. Okay. There at one point, way down later, much later, the Air National Guard had what were called MISSIP A models, and they had JTIDs.
Okay.
We had straight A models way before JTIDs or Fiddle fighter data link. So we had the kind of the bare minimum, like the F-15s that rolled off the assembly line in 1976. Those are the ones that we flew. In fact, our tails were 76, 77, 78, that kind of a thing. They were very early F-15s with no upgrades.
What sort of range were you then able to pick up on this older radar then? What sort of range were you able to pick up something like a Bear? I mean, I've been told that those big contra-rotating props are just fantastic radar reflectors. So
and that's true. What you've heard is true. And the A model radar was very, very capable. And there, depending on what mode and all that you want to use, the finding them was not the difficulty. Normally, it would be the intercept geometry. You're coming east out of Langley, they're headed south, and unless all the timing is done correctly, you can ensure that they're going to go further down where they're handed off to somebody else, maybe the guys out of Florida or whatever. But you're not necessarily going to get close enough to join up with them. Okay. But the detection part was generally not as big of that was not the issue. It's more a matter of the geometry of the whole tactical problem and the notification process through all the NORAD channels that was completely oblivious to us. We just are in an alert barn. The horn goes off, you run to your airplane, you take off, you get your tasking, and out you go.
So having heard you say, and just reinforce it then with that answer, that you didn't necessarily get to fly up on the wing of these things because of the distances involved. I did have a question for you around the VI button in the Eagle. There's the visual intercept button.
Yeah.
Did anybody ever use that?
You would use it. The only time I ever played with it was in the simulator. Okay. It's not a bad thing. It's just not necessary if you're doing a normal tactical intercept and you decide that you want to place your airplane a certain distance behind the basically what's a relatively cooperative target to begin with. You don't need a VI button to help you do that. You just go ahead and run the intercept geometry, turn the corner, and put your airplane where you needed it to be.
Okay.
Not a bad thing, but it was unnecessary. I will tell you, culturally, if you went to the debrief and you were running in VI mode, even on an air defense practice thing, you're probably going to take some heat.
Okay. I think they deleted it in the end, didn't they? I'm not sure if
I don't know. That's a good question. It's probably probably all those buttons are about as shiny as the day that they came off the assembly line.
Wasn't one of them air to ground? Was it? So I don't remember. Nav air to air. I don't remember. We'd have to
go look.
Yeah. Okay. There's no way you'd admit to it, even if you knew.
True. Right? That's right.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about culture then. I'm curious, having said that you were the redheaded stepchild of the wing,
Mm-hmm.
And having said that actually you did the same things and then that made you sort of up your game a little bit. When you went to be an instructor, that, as you've said right at the beginning, that was just after Desert Storm. That's when those guys were coming home. Now the wing did not perform that well in Desert Storm. I think that's fair to say. I think from what
I would not say that.
You would not.
I wouldn't say that at all.
Okay.
No. Number one, we hadn't been to war since Vietnam. When they were given the go order and they had to get ready quickly and get airplanes off the ground, they did a phenomenal job, and that had not been done for a long time. So did a great job getting there as quickly as the National Command Authority wanted them to. I think what you're referring to is the kill differential between the first fighter wing and the Eglin guys. And that's not really something I can speak to other than my just study of history. So I'd rather not go down that path, but I would disagree with the context that the first fighter wing guys underperformed. No, I think they did what they were asked to do. I do think, in my personal opinion only, there were some wing leadership decisions that were made that ultimately benefited the Eglin guys because their leadership, I think, made the right calls, and the Langley leadership maybe. But as far as the pilots and the airplanes and the maintenance and the armament guys, they did exactly what they were asked to do. And I think they should be exceedingly proud of what they did. And at the end game, I think from all your interviews, there's a lot of luck factor in if you're at the right place in the right time and you do a good job and you get the kill. And there's plenty of guys that did the right job, they're just not at the right place at the right time through no fault of their own. But the result of the war was phenomenal. So I don't like throwing shade on either group. At the time, as a young wingman, did I like the guys in the first fighter wing as far as an organization? No. We felt like that we were, kind of got the end of the spectrum on the technology and on the training dollars and all that. But as far as people, they were great. In fact, one of our main roles during the Gulf War while I was at the 48th was when they left, they had a whole bunch of guys that had just shown up as young lieutenants who were not MQT yet. So the wing leaders worked with our guys because they knew we had a very experienced corps, and we trained a lot of their guys through MQT. And a lot of those guys went on to do very good things, even though they weren't trained by the first fighter wing because they were primarily deployed. But at home, they didn't have the assets to take care of them, and they asked us to. So we had a bunch of new lieutenants, which was unusual for us because we had this more experienced corps. But it was a great opportunity for us to, be good instructors and to, help those guys out. And it worked out really, really well.
Was there any part of you that was thinking, well, I'm sure there was, but to what degree was there a part of you thinking you wish that you had been on the list to deploy?
I think all of us thought that. I was probably young enough that it didn't really occur to me quite as much as some of our weapons officers who had been doing this for a lot longer than I had, because I got there in 1988. So I was only I was still just maybe coming out of a wingman status when everybody left, and so there were other guys you could clearly see that they were much more heartbroken. I was like, at that stage in my career, just kind of trying to do the best I can, hanging on, try to be the best wingman I can. The bigger picture of what it meant to be deploying wasn't really at the forefront of where my survival instinct was at the time. But I did see, and one of the most poignant moments was, and this is a kind of another just fortunate happenstance, once all the airplanes, both Eglin and Langley and all these folks deployed for not only Desert Shield, but also Desert Storm and the aftermath of doing the Southern Watch and Northern Watch, there was a deficit of Eagles available stateside to support things like the Fighter Weapons School F-16 training and stuff like that. We did a lot of that, and I didn't realize at the time, but that was really, really a great opportunity to develop as an Eagle diver by the vast number of TDYs. We were gone all the time going to fly DACT in support of other syllabuses, primarily at Nellis. So that ended up being a good thing when I became an instructor down at Tindal, because at the same time that as a fleet, there was a lot of degradation maybe in daily skills because people are doing, the sorties over Iraq, just boring holes in the sky, getting lots of hours, but very little training. Our experience was the opposite. We were getting a ton of training because people needed us, and our squadron leadership was very plugged in and got us opportunity after opportunity to do so.
Let's talk a little bit about weapons then. So it sort of applies to, of course, the AIM-7 being used in Desert Storm.
Mm-hmm.
When I was talking to Fred about the 106, he was talking about the AIM-4 and the Genie. So presumably then AIM-7M was the primary weapon for your air defense.
Correct. For us, for our WRM at the time, the AIM-7M with the Fs had pretty much left. So we trained, and we would, our alert jets had AIM-7Ms, generally 4 of them. And then the AIM-9M, if I remember correctly, maybe when I first got there, it may have been a few Ls around, but primarily AIM-9M and AIM-7M are the weapons that we had. And to my mind, from my experience at the time, both were highly capable, and they were very, very good at that time. I know there were a lot of issues in Desert Storm with no fires and stuff, but that's kind of one of those things you learn on the go that you don't necessarily see when you're in day-to-day training.
So I'm just curious to know whether or not then So what I've been told about the Sparrow was that it was designed to shred the cockpit of the aeroplane that it was being fired at. So the timing of the fuse and the type of warhead, um, assuming a head-on shot, is that it was timed to fuse where the cockpit was, so it would actually shred the front fuselage of the aeroplane. I'm just wondering, it's a big warhead, it's a big missile, but I'm just wondering then whether you were expecting to shoot one at a bear, or whether or not you had a, shoot, look, shoot type approach to it. How
Yeah,
many were you going to shoot
for
to take one down?
right, right. Excellent question. Yet for a large airplane, and I'm going back on some pretty old memories here, but our expectation was it was going to take more than one missile of any type to take down something as large as a bear or similar size target.
Okay. And do you think so? So there, I know this might sound like a weird question, and I already know from what you said that you're not in a position to answer it from a position of authority. But the
Okay.
fact they got rid of the Genie, this nuclear tipped rocket, that they were going to fire into the formation of the bombers, and then that was going to, sort of break them all up and destroy them, whatever. Is there a reason, do you think, or what the reason might there be for the Air Force to discontinue using that? Why wasn't that put onto the F-15? Did
Yeah,
anybody ever talk
and
about
like
that?
you said, I'm not an expert, but leaning back on my NORAD planning experience, leaning back on my F-15 experience, absolutely it was the right decision because of the following thing. At the point in time where I believe, when the Genie was invented and the nuclear weapon, they were primarily facing a gravity bomb threat from these bears. So they would have to kind of go very deep into your country. They would have to probably be a bunch of them together to get to whatever they're doing. And you might have those opportunities. By the time that we were working that same tactical or strategic problem, now you've entered the era of cruise missiles. So we're not expecting a whole bunch of airplanes all together because one little bear on his little sortie can dump a whole bunch of cruise missiles going to different places. So I think the opportunity for the weapons engagement, as I understand it, for that Genie missile, that was no longer a valid idea. And you were much more likely to try to get out there as far as you can and get to them before they have an opportunity to employ whatever weapons, but you're not going to find a whole bunch of them together. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. But so it begs the question then, if you can talk about it, what were your tactics then against a cruise missile threat then? So you already said that you would typically, because of the ranges, you wouldn't get close to them to join up on their wing and sort of transition with them down the East Coast and so on
Right.
and so forth. You'd be there to make sure they didn't do anything. But
And
um,
but
so how?
the yeah, the key there though is you have to also remember we were in kind of deep peacetime stuff in relation to the Soviet Union, and they hadn't ramped up like DEF CONs and all that crazy stuff. So that's going to change how you interact with a foreign air force than if there's very high tension levels and things like that. But I think what you're getting at is we did work on something, and as far as I know, there's no real problem with talking about it because it makes sense. We worked a lot with what we called long range defense teams, which is you combine tankers, you provide an AWACS and F-15s, and you send them out as far as you can to intercept and destroy as early as you can before anybody has chances to employ whatever their weapons might be. So that was kind of the big picture. Now those are very resource intensive, and that's a difficult thing to do on a basically a continental basis. But that was probably the solution set that I think we were looking at, vice like the Genie thing or anything like that. That was kind of what we did. You didn't train a lot for it, but all the building blocks that we did, if you were a good Eagle driver, it didn't matter. Just like for the guys in Desert Storm, they had lots and lots of practice in air refueling. If you can do that and you're a good Eagle driver, you can go do whatever mission they need you to do.
Did you then train to the scenario where you had intercepted too late and from the belly of the bear had emerged, I don't know what a bear can carry, I don't know, 10 cruise missiles or something.
I don't even remember anymore either,
Yeah.
but yeah, a bunch of stuff. It's a big airplane.
Did you
Yeah.
train to that then?
Um,
I mean, there's a low RCS targets. I don't
yeah,
know. Again, I don't know the profile. I don't know if they fly a high-low profile or if they go low immediately. But did you train for the scenario that actually you didn't get there or you weren't able to get there at the right time, and now you're hunting down cruise missiles?
right. Uh, the training for that would have been exceedingly difficult. So to answer your question roundabout, were we aware that there might be, in some theoretical sense, a scenario where you have that in front of you, you need to figure out how to fix it? Probably, at least we were thinking about it, maybe discussing it in our weapons and tactics meetings at some level. But as far as training at it, no, because you'd have to find, and this is way early, so you're not going to have low RCS targets and all this kind of stuff. But um, so no, and in fact, most of our training in that regard, once again, you have to put yourself in the idea that you have not had this, giant conflagration that's kind of developing. Most of our training would center on making sure that we are 100% clear on what authorities we did and did not have in relation to National Command Authority through NORAD and all that, so that we're not the ones that lit the match and cause something way worse than the actual situation that we were in because you're gung ho and you want to, do something. So that was, I think, more of the emphasis was on almost like the air discipline of the whole scenario. That okay, make sure you're reporting clearly, you're getting clear instructions. It was a little bit of a different focus, but we're not in DEFCON 1. We're in whatever DEFCON 5, deep peace, and we're just trying to make sure these guys aren't bothering us or going to do something stupid.
I don't want to press the issue too much, but I'm curious to know.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that it's sort of, I think, an interesting question now, particularly, is because the Eagle is going out, the Strike Eagle is going out, shooting down drones, shooting down cruise missiles fired out of Iran at Israel. So it's doing that kind of mission. It's hunting down. So I know it's a different scenario, but
Yep.
a practical point of view, firing a very expensive missile and a very small, limited number of missiles against a very sort of numerous or more numerous threat. That's kind of one of the challenges that you have. And I'm just curious to know whether or not you ever sort of sat down and thought, well, if that happens, I'm gonna use the gun. I'm gonna try and find these things on the radar. I'm gonna lock them up. I'm gonna use the gun. I'll use the missiles first, then I'll turn to the gun. I'm just curious to know in your mind how far you took the scenario.
Sure, sure. I would say, at the time, um, given the significance of a strategic threat where you're expecting that any weapon that is launched is probably nuclear, you're probably going to do whatever it takes. Your country has a really neat history of guys using wingtips to turn over the V1s or the V2s. I think it was the V1 because that was slower. And we actually discussed the same thing. Was it primary game plan number one? Of course not. But you're like, hey, in a discussion forum, if you think there's something nuclear going to somewhere that you care about, you're going to do whatever it takes to get that down. So that in that regard, yes. As far as a actual training, of course not. But yeah, so I guess that hopefully kind of answers that.
Yeah, I mean, so the other question I suppose that I'm curious about with regards to the scenario, you mentioned AWACS a couple of times. You talked specifically about maybe some training
Mm-hmm.
crews on the US AWACS, which meant sometimes they were
Sure.
helpful, sometimes not so much. But how much independence as an Eagle guy were you expecting to have? I mean, were you? I know that sounds like a strange question. Are you when you're training for the mission? Are you sort of doing a building block approach where initially it's going to be you guys just go out as a four ship, work your radars, do your thing, and then you start integrating AWACS later on? Or are you flying with AWACS on every mission? Are you expecting AWACS to be there? Are you expecting any ground-based radars to be helping you? How much of this is autonomous, you going out and doing your thing? How much of it is guided and directed by a command authority?
Well, I think it depends if you're talking, kind of the peacetime scenario or no kidding, on the brink of global thermal nuclear war or some crazy thing like that. Um, For the peacetime scenario, you're very, very well integrated with either ground GCI or AWACS because you need the links back to the NORAD command authority kind of stuff. On the wartime scenario, I think the thought was that you would expect to be at many times potentially independent, going with the ROE that you had when you lost the communications or whatever, and so that you'd make your decisions based off of that. But you use whatever you have available. But yes, I think there was an expectation that there would be more independent activity on the very serious war side of thing, whereas you're not going to have that on the deep peace, more intercept kind of thing.
Does the workings of something like a four-ship wall of eagles change because you're intercepting? I mean, we're talking about a wartime scenario again, but because you're intercepting a bunch of bombers rather than a bunch of fighters. So, my understanding of it is that you've got four aeroplanes, you spread the radars out. Somebody takes the high and left, someone takes high and right, someone takes low and left, someone takes low and right, and then you sanitize the airspace and do all that stuff. Does it change? If you're doing
the Eagle employment would not necessarily change, but I think the situations and the scenarios that you would be involved in are very, very likely to change, in that I think it's much less likely that you're going to have a limited geographical area, and it's much less likely that you're going to have a concentration of forces where you're going to have the four guys. Now, we train day to day as a four-ship of Eagle, so we could do that. But if you can do that, you can also split up into 2-2s. And if you needed to be, you can split up into singles. If you needed to chase down a very high value target that is of little threat to us directly, but is of great threat potentially strategically or to the nation. So does that kind of cover it? I mean,
it does. I guess I'm trying to understand. So whether or not you guys had sort of then contract within the flight that if certain things happened, you would end up doing that split to two and then to ones, and how do you coordinate? How because this is pre-data link days, so how do you know who's shooting at who? What's the how did it work?
The way that the Eagle community did it from the beginning up until data link became much more common, which is a lot of communications. So, in many respects, that was also what the Gulf War guys had to deal with. They had a lot more. They had limited. I don't even know if any of them had data link at that point, but they had a lot of communications. And some of your previous episodes, they talked through very, very effectively the difficulties with communications and making sure that it's as accurate, concise, and clear as it can be. And so that is exactly how we dealt with it. The neat thing is, if you train day to day to go 4VX against a tactical threat and you master those communications, those are much more complicated and moving at a much faster rate than the communications you would need against a more, I'll call it a benign threat. Strategically, it's not benign, but in an air-to-air, perspective, it is benign in that this thing's probably not, these airplanes are not maneuvering, definitely not maneuvering aggressively. And, if you find multiples and they're split widely, you're going to go get as many as you can. So yes, we were confident in that. In fact, since you bring that up, one of the things we did support during this time frame was way back in the day. I think it was still Strategic Air Command, but maybe it had already transitioned to TACT. They would have the SAC bomb comp, which is a bomb competition for FB-111s and B-52s and B-1s. And the ones that we supported were out in the airspace around Utah. And so they would have these runs where they're trying to get through what we were playing at the time was red air. And many of those, we were operating as single ships, chasing these guys down. And to us, it was decent training in regards to our potential wartime air defense mission, because that would not be an unusual situation for us to expect to encounter. But on a day-to-day training basis is not something that, you don't have to spend a lot of time on it, because if you're good at 4VX, you can definitely go chase down this bomber. Now, there's some high-speed considerations and things like that. We would train to that in the simulator back at Langley. And then during this bomb comp, we definitely got to use them with the B-1s and the FB-111s. And that was kind of cool to do. Not to mention they were down at low altitude, which also made it really, really fun.
Quick question then, just around the bears, and again, it's a wartime scenario, and then I'd like to come back to the high speed side of things. But what? So everyone listening to this will know what the exploding cantaloupe is. You know, the F-16 tactic of everyone
Right.
spinning in the different directions, just at the point where you're going to go and do your sort and pick who you're going to shoot or whatever in the Eagle.
Mm-hmm.
So that's their sort of disruptive tactic for that. What were you expecting the equivalent to be for the bears? How are they going? What were you expecting them to do to make it difficult for you to find them and shoot them and kill them?
Yeah, I would say and it's just a generalized category. I don't want to go very much into specifics, but it would be electronic countermeasures or ECM. We were expecting a broad variety of types and employment of the bear to use as much, survivable ECM as they could have to try to, keep us at bay or defeat our attempts to kill them.
Okay. Were you also expecting them to do things like be, sort of very sort of strung out by great distances, so that they actually you end up getting to the point where you need to go back to the tanker and then they're going to sneak in? Were you expecting sort of a physical capability like that too?
Single word, no. That would involve for a lot of those, the big airplanes, as far as like bomber sorties, and think back to your knowledge of like World War II and stuff like that. They want to, number one, they're very gas limited if they want to survive and not swim in the Arctic Ocean. So they're going to probably just have a certain route and a certain time, and they need to be at a certain place, get that done, and get out if they can. So I don't think there was a lot of opportunity, not to mention that, maneuvering those big airplanes may sound good on paper, but in reality, it's probably a pretty difficult scenario. And it may or may not even affect anything as far as if they turn away and their CM antennas aren't pointing in the right direction, it could be worse rather than better. So I don't think that to me, in my just personal opinion, that was a very unlikely, probably not going to happen kind of a thing.
Okay.
It would also involve a high degree of situational awareness on the bomber crew, who has external support, no GCI, no AWACS, no nothing. He's far, far away from home to have any concept of where we were and what we're doing. So that becomes kind of I think, problematic for that to actually happen.
Tell us about these sort of high-speed intercepts then against FB-111 and I was going to say B-52, but that wouldn't be correct. So it'd be B-1.
The Eagle obviously is fast. They are very fast, and they're getting down at low altitude. And the key to that is setting your initial geometry correctly and early, so that you can get out in front and not in some kind of a tail chase. You had a very good discussion here recently on one of your episodes with, talking about trying to chase somebody down at very high speed. It was going from Iraq to Iran. And in our case, that's something we're trying to avoid. And with the B1s, if you have good AWACS or good GCI, that works out really, really, really well. If you can trust them, particularly the AWACS, since they have the look down. If you have a good working relationship and you trust them, you can ask them to give you basically a very initial cutoff vector, which may take this threat off of your radar scope. But geometry-wise, it gets you out in front where he cannot evade you. And then you turn back in. You have to have the situational awareness to make sure that's not happening too late and all that. But that is effective and sometimes necessary. And if not, whenever you see the numbers on your radar that indicate a very high-speed target, one of the first things you're doing is probably putting them to one edge or the other of your radar scope to try to get as much lead on this guy as you can to get out front and get as good of a missile shot as you can.
You said earlier that when you were talking about the F-14, that you didn't spend as much time maybe as you could have, analyzing the AIM-54, the Phoenix, because there wasn't a comparable threat. And one of the things I was thinking, and I guess this is sort of germane to this conversation, is MiG-25, MiG-31, FOXHOUND, FOXBAT threat. Did you train to that? Did they have I just don't know enough about them, but I'm sure they had a really big fat missile that was probably a Russian ripoff of a Phoenix or something like that. Did you train to that? Was that something you thought about?
Not that I remember very specifically. No, I don't think that was considered at the time. I know we were obviously concerned in a tactical environment, which is the most amount of training that we did of 21s, 23s, 29s. I think that was kind of the threat basket of the day. Aware of the other ones, but I think by that point, also some of the FOXHOUND and the FOXBAT and all that had been a little bit demystified. Not completely, because obviously in the Gulf War we learned some stuff, but that was not a common training adversary, as it were.
Okay. We spent quite a lot of time talking about about the 48th fizz that we're not allowed to call fizz.
Yeah.
So I should move the conversation along, really, shouldn't I? So
Sure.
you went from there, then you became a B course instructor, and this is obviously then seeing the guys come back, and you've just sort of given your sort of very tactful, I think, assessment of how you think things went for the first fighter wing in that particular conflict. What were you hearing then specifically, or were you hearing anything specifically from the guys coming back from that in terms of things to pass on to students? I mean, I understand the B course is just to get someone to a point where they can go to a squadron and become a wingman. You're not teaching them to be a master tactician. Was there a transfer of knowledge coming from the squadrons coming back to you that you then imparted to the B course students?
Not that I specifically remember. It wasn't that we were discounting anything that anybody was bringing back, but the assignment cycle in the Air Force at that time was kind of weird, and a lot of guys were able to stay with their units quite a bit. So the influx of folks that had experience in the Gulf War, it took a while, and I left in 1994. I was from 91 to 94 is when I was down at the RTU. So I don't think there was a big influx of guys quite yet. They were probably starting to show up as I was, towards the end of my time there.
Yeah. What were your observations of that then? So you'd spent 4 years teaching people to fly as a FAPE. You're now teaching people to fly the F-15 through the B course, which I think is about 6 months or something like that, isn't it?
Sounds about right.
And it is just to get them to the point where they can turn up at a squadron and be a wingman. Is that also correct?
Yeah, we were in a time of transition actually at Tindal. We had a really, really talented core, almost like a critical mass of weapons officers. I don't know if they were brought there intentionally. I kind of think they were. Or if it was just lucky happenstance. And there was a group, probably about 5 or 6 of them, and they kind of spearheaded the change from just graduating a guy who needed full up MQT to, I think we called it a near ready or near MQT ready wingman. So we were kicking the guys out with a lot more training under their belt than they used to. Same amount of sorties, but we actually redeveloped the syllabus and refocused it, trying to get the guys to as close to mission ready. And the whole idea was that the folks out in the CAF, the Combat Air Forces, all the Eagle squadrons around the world had said this MQT burden is very, very difficult. And especially at that time, they're doing Southern Watch, they're doing Northern Watch. So there's a lot of demands on their resources. And they asked the legitimate question, what can we do to maybe reduce this? And so, in fact, I got to work that project while I was at Tindal, which was very, very fun and interesting, of revamping the syllabus completely. So we went from A model syllabus to a C model AMRAAM syllabus. So that was a big change. And then we were also trying to produce a nearly MQT qualified guy that would require hopefully many fewer sorties at his gaining unit than they had in previous days. We also had to develop a supporting simulator for that, because you can't do all that in the airplane with the allotted sorties, because you're not going to get more sorties out of the powers that be at the Air Force. So we had to really ramp up the syllabus or the simulator capability. And I actually was involved in that as well, It did not happen while I was there, but by the time I came back from my TX course, we had now a minimum of 4-ship, full visual, interconnected simulator that could also tap into the GCI school that was right down the street on
Really?
Tindal. Yes.
Oh, and this is mid-90s. This we're talking about as
This
well.
is
Wow.
right. And the way that kind of unfolded was kind of interesting in a way. I was loving flying. I really loved being an RTUIP. I really, really grew. To me, that was the time where everything kind of gelled, and I became what I considered kind of the peak of my capabilities was at my time at the RTU. Partly because I was surrounded by this really good core of weapons guys that were doing outstanding instruction and teaching us how to be as good as we could be instructing, and we were flying our butts off. So that was really, really cool. But the simulators that we would take the students to, they were single ship. The only visual in the whole damn thing was the HUD, just the green lines in the HUD, nothing behind it, no terrain, no air, no nothing. And it was truthfully kind of a part task trainer and a little bit on how to run a radar as if you were flying at night in the weather all the time by yourself. That's not how you employ the Eagle. Never has been. But the simulator technology that was developed in the 70s with the airplane, that's all they could do. And that simulator technology was a lot better than what the previous generation was provided in the F4 simulators. So it was an improvement. By the time that I'm here in the mid 90s, it's not cutting it. So I had gone to the Air Force Academy. I probably was a little bit of an academic snob. And then I thought, well, if I ever get a master's, I'll get a real master's. So I just put it off. I'm loving flying. I don't want to do it. And I had a very good DO. They changed the environment. For a long time, they told us, you don't need a master's to move up the ranks and keep on flying. Just go do your flying. I thought, this is great. They changed the rules. So my DO walks in and he goes, you go get your master's now. No questions. I went, yes, sir. Went out and did it. Well, I wanted kind of a theme to my career was every chance I had to do something that was air-to-air related or supporting the air-to-air community, I tried to do that. So master's was bullshit. I took the easiest course I could, the one that gave me the most credit for being an RTUIP and all that stuff. But they did have a paper at the end, not a thesis. I didn't write a thesis, but I had to write kind of a, finishing paper. So I wrote a paper where I, in my head, designed a multi-ship, full visual simulator connected to an advanced debriefing system and GCI. I gave it to the guy, he gave me a passing grade. So that's the only thing I cared about. But he goes, you need to take this to the wing commander. I said, yeah, sure. Captain Salcedo is going to take this to the wing commander. No. So thank you. I appreciate that you think it's of value. That's very kind of you. Did I get my credit? Can I get the hell out of here? Well, he took it to the wing commander without telling me. And so the next thing I know, I get a note says, go see the ops group commander at this time. And my first thought, as with most guys that fly, is, what did I fuck up? And so I go in there and there's the wing weapons officer. There's a neat, really great guy. His call sign is Pads. I haven't talked to him, so I won't use his real name. But he was an Eagle guy who came back to our wing from having time on the air staff doing money, things related to money. I knew nothing about Air Force money other than my paycheck. So I get in that room, I'm kind of looking around, and they go, hey, the wing commander read your paper, and you're going to leave here in a few months, because they'd already set that I was going to school and do my staff job. But you have about 6 or 8 months. We want you to go. We're going to give you this budget. Pads will help you with the money. Go find out what the art of the possible is and give us a finalized design before you leave this base. Okay. And so that's what I got to do with them, and went to all the various full visual simulators in existence at that time. One was down at Luke, one was at Williams, one was at the Mac Air Sims in St. Louis, and some other ones, and basically trying to get something that would be quick to fund and would be effective. Gave it to them, and off I leave. Did my part. 4 years later, when I come back, that simulator is on the base. So that was that was pretty cool. And it wasn't yet, it was still being checked out and done, so it wasn't that being used for students, but it was very close. And the people that I worked with at Tindal, many of the civilians and stuff were still there. They go, Shamu, your sim is here. And it wasn't really my sim, but they were very kind and that. And I said, cool. So they go, grab one of your other TX students. And another guy rechecking out in the Eagle. He was a weapons school guy. He's a neat guy. And we went and we flew the sim. We're like, this rocks. We had a very, very good time because it was such a change from that simple, almost useless technology that we had left, 4 years ago for both of us.
So tell me a bit more about the sim then. So nowadays there is, I think it's called distributed mission training. I think it's a Boeing product. I say it as though it's a new thing. It's not. It's been around a long time. I was not aware that in the mid-90s this had already happened. Was this then?
Well, you have to be careful. What we did there was just the precursor. This was just the very beginning of things that have exploded now with whatever live, virtual, construct, and all this kind of stuff. It was a very, very early, and in truth, probably a pretty primitive advancement on comparing to what's being done now. We clearly recognized the need, and we were able to basically cobble together something using, computers are getting better, visual systems are getting better, connectivity was getting better. And the key was obviously you have to do it in a secure environment. And so we were able to get a system that did that. This was all just on Tindal Air Force Base in support of the RTU. We were fortunate enough to have the GCI guys down the street. So that's a relatively simple thing to tie them into a simulator on the same base, in the same command, in the same wing. We were not doing the worldwide stuff that now I think, and I've been out of the business for a long time, but from my understanding, you could have Eagles in one location flying a simulator mission with F-18s from another location, AWACS from a third location, and all over the world in different time zones, whatever you need. That was not us. This was a early attempt. Our big goal was, or at least what I was trying to do in that paper, was design a simulator that could support the RTU syllabus, because we were asking so much more out of these students. If you cannot go to a simulator and have them do a radar defeating notch or, a big crank or be involved in a 2V or a 4V, but you want to do that in the airplane with guys with very little time, that's kind of nuts. But if you can take them to the simulator and do it a couple of times and work out the kinks and the comm and all that stuff, now you're going to be much more effective in the air. So that was our focus. There was no sense in my mind, or I think anybody in the wing, that we were going to, quote unquote, change the world of simulation. It was, we had a specific problem. How do we develop this near MQT wingman with a simulator that can't support the modern day tactics and weapons that we needed to train these guys on? And this was more of a Rube Goldberg, duct tape and paperclip solution to that. The cool thing was that the wing leadership was so strong that they supported it, made it happen, found a guy who could make the money piece happen, and were able to turn this around in pretty record time, considering how long it takes, like an F-22 program or an F-35 program and all those things to come along. That was pretty remarkable on their behalf. I just happened to be the guy there, with a candle in a dark room going, I think this is a light, and they went, yeah, let's take that. We'll make it into something workable. So that's kind of how that evolved.
Let's go back to simpler things then, and just talk about your experience
Sure.
then teaching in the F-15. So you had those 4 years teaching as a FAPE. What's the difference between then, from an instructional point of view, as a teacher? What's the difference between
Right.
teaching somebody to fly an airplane and then teaching someone to fly an airplane and operate it as a weapon system?
You really hit it in that it's that last part. We're not teaching them how to fly. We are teaching them how to run the weapon system. So the focus is really there. The instructional techniques are different. It's a much more, big boy, big girl approach in that these guys are expected to know what they need for that sortie when they show up in the FAPE environment or the pilot training environment, there's a little more expectation that there'll be more hand holding, whatever. There's not a lot. It's still very challenging. But the Eagle course is exceedingly demanding. I would say of everything I ever did in my entire career, that F-15B course was probably about as hard as it got, as far as just the pace and the volume of information and the expectations and the standards and everything. So that's the environment that they're in. Now, I will tell you that over the course of my career, the younger guys coming in just truthfully got better and better. I don't know if it was because they were exposed to more computers at a younger age than, you know, my generation was or whatever, but they were very, very effective at being, you know, really good sponges. And a lot of what we taught had to do with, I think, instilling, and you've talked about it before with other guys who can talk to it better than I can, that kind of eagle mentality, that approach. Some people think it comes across as a little bit arrogant. My experience was it wasn't. That group of core guys that we had at Tindal in the early 90s, you know, they pretty much defined that humble, approachable, credible thing, and that's what they put in the IP core. And you know, they got some really, really good results out of it.
Would you then, in your view, having said that the B course was the hardest, you know, thing that you did in that respect, would you say that then the expansion of the B course then to get someone to a point where they're almost MQT ready, did that make it even harder, even more difficult?
In a way, no, because that one of the problems was in the past, the RTU had primarily A models, like I was flying at the 48th, but the fleet had C models and MISSIP and all this other things. So those guys would learn this, but have no clue that when they got to their unit, they'd have to do the C model stuff or the MISSIP stuff or whatever. And they were at the simultaneously as we were transitioning from A's to C's, and even MISSIP C's. So the result was they went in there one time, they learned it, and they got it, and they would be able to take that directly to their unit, as opposed to having this transition after transition. So that helped a lot, because the technology at the RTU, I've always felt, you know, and you hear a lot of people say, you know, train like you're going to fight. Very, very true in multiple military, you know, arenas. But that was not happening at the RTU when I first arrived, and it was well on its way to happening by the time that, you know, I left and returned as a TX student. I was like, these guys are really getting this correct. So that helped a lot. So it would be almost like if you're going to train a Formula One driver and you send him to VW school, and then you have him go to, you know, Camaro school, and then finally he's in. Yes, he's going to get better over time, but that's a lot of training invested that may not completely transition over, as opposed to you send him to one Formula One school and he's working on the, you know, the thing that he's going to drive in the race. So that might be a bad example, but that one came to mind. So
yeah, that makes sense. What about then? You said that, you know, 10, 15 minutes ago, you said that one of the things that was key about the FTU role was that it was now including AMRAAM. So AMRAAM's come along. I always, whenever I do an F-15 interview, somebody always says, "What's MISSIP? What's MISSIP?" So could you just give us a sort of a MISSIP AMRAAM 101? You know, what is, you know, what has happened to the aeroplane? What's the relevance of AMRAAM? What's the relevance of MISSIP?
The big change with AMRAAM, which I think is well understood, is you now have a missile that has an active capability. So with the AIM-7, when I go ahead and lock up the target that I assign, the target that is my sword, I shoot, I have to maintain a radar lock, which basically takes my situational awareness about the rest of the fight and puts a soda straw on the one guy that I'm watching that I'm trying to kill. Not a bad thing, and it's way better than previous generations, but now my situational awareness is primarily coming through the communications from everybody else in the flight, and putting that mental picture together on what's happening and making sure that my missile is behaving appropriately, and going to do what it's supposed to do. And if it is defeated, figure that out, snip it, and get back to where I can find somebody else to kill. Now you move it along and you have the fighter data link, So you have that situational awareness visually on what other people are doing. It requires a lot less comms, a lot less processing going on in your brain. And with the AMRAAM missile, you're able to push both initial ranges out and also ranges where you can go, that missile knows what it's doing. Snip, and I can go look at something else. I can even go to do something else while it still needs my help. So there was major advances in your ability to basically multi-target and to do either pre-planned tactical maneuvering once the missiles are in the air, or defensive maneuvering once your missile's in the air, because that missile has its own onboard inherent capability to continue to attack your adversary.
From an FTU point of view, then from a B Corps student's point of view, is this sort of a complex thing to do then? And are you also, as a community, because it's fairly new, the capability, have you really sort of got well developed tactics that you can actually pass on to the students? I mean, how much of this is still you figuring it out? How much of it is we know how it works and this is what you need to do?
The Air Force is really, really good. One of the things I think they excel at as far as the fighter community across the board, specific to the Eagle, but my understanding is it's on all the other, the F-16, the A-10, whatever, is that they're very good at developing tactics and doing standardization. It doesn't mean you're locked in and you're only allowed to do it this way, but there is kind of a generalized approved solution that we know kind of works. We're going to learn it. And the neat thing was, and I got to really see this later on in my career where I was bouncing around flying with a lot of different units. You walk into any unit, you're speaking the same language, you understand the same parameters, and you're able to execute, even if you've just met this guy and never ever flown with him before. You know, a lot of your folks talked about the value of having the wingmen, consistent wingmen during their wartime sorties. Absolutely agree with that. But the neat thing about the Air Force is you could pluck one of those guys out, put him in another squadron in another place, kind of like the Schusterbird guys did, going to work with the Bitburg guys. And it's fairly seamless. And the more, and it got, I'd say, better over the years as I was in the Eagle, where it became a community of the well understood tactics and standards. Doesn't mean you're not going to adapt them to the situation at hand, but if you have that understanding baseline level of knowledge and execution and communication, that's a good place to start.
You talked a little earlier about culture. You referenced it, and you said that it might have looked on the outside a bit harsh, but I think you felt that it was sort of fairly reasonable. That was the sense I got from you. What were the sort of cultural tenets of being an Eagle student pilot? I mean, you've just said that you were expected to turn up and know what you were doing, but were there other things that were, you know, as Eagle guys, you took your, you know, you had expectations of the students that they would do or not do, you know, there's a language, isn't there, that is, I suppose, sort of not particular or peculiar to the Eagle community on its own. Yeah. And it's, you know, fighter pilots generally say certain things or don't say certain things. You already said, did you say it was a period dot? I think you said earlier in the conversation. So there are ways of talking. I'm just curious to get a sense for, you know, as a young guy and presumably later as a young woman arriving at the B course, what sort of things were you having to pick up other than how to fly and employ?
I think you were picking up in general of, you know, kind of how fighter pilots within a squadron context interact. The students weren't treated in pilot training. They're trying to kind of treated like a little separate entity, in that they're, you know, that they're there. They may or may not get through, and once they do, they're definitely clearly out of our community and going somewhere else. Within at least my experience at the 2nd Fighter Squadron, which is where I was an RTU instructor, was no, you know, they're clearly a instructor-student relationship, but they were part of our squadron. So when we ever did anything, it was everybody. The students were expected to be there, the IPs were expected to be there, the interactions, and, you know, you've had other folks talk about, you know, in the debrief, you know, as far as like the ranks come off and all that. Yeah, in the debrief, if I screwed something up, I'm going to let that guy know, not so much just a mea culpa, but that he understands that what he saw may or may not have been the right solution on that thing, and to do it differently, or how I would do it differently next time. So that almost brutal honesty, I think that's one of the cultural elements. That the very tight knit squadrons, that's another cultural element. And you're 100% correct. That is not exclusive to the Eagle community. That is across, at least in my experience, not just the United States Air Force, but in my interactions with the French Air Force, the UK Air Force. It's pretty much a fighter thing that I think has developed over time, maybe just because of survivability. If you don't do that, your chances of surviving may very well go down. It's almost a natural selection.
Yeah, things like you can't say bomb though. You have to spell it BOMB, or the B
I
word.
don't even know what word you're talking about.
Excellent. Okay. Anyone would
Yeah,
think
and
that
you're
was.
right. There's all sorts of little peculiarities.
Yeah.
And in
And then
fact, it
are
was
you
kind of funny, just a quick aside. My daughter set it up where I go working out with her a couple days a week, and we have a trainer. And this gal told me that I needed to do what we would call a deceased insect thing for the workout, but she used the other terminology. And so I told her that I could not say that because I didn't want to buy everybody in the gym a beer. And she's like looking at me strange. And I said, I'll explain it to you. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's a little underlying language that we all have.
are you teaching the students that as well then? So this is sort of what I'm.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think the focus is on the airplane and what they do from takeoff to landing, and really what they do from fights on to knock it off. That is absolutely the focus. But there's a lot of other elements around that of fighter pilot culture, expectations in the brief, expectations in the debrief, how to behave, and I got just an excellent of that. Yes, they did a great job at the B course that I went through. But when I got to the 48th, that's where I really saw how a very tight knit culture could pull a squadron together and, do some pretty cool things. And that was also resident in spades at the RTU. And the neat thing about the RTU was among the IP Corps in the second, we had guys from Bitburg, guys from Schusterberg, guys from Kadena, guys from Eglin, guys from Langley, both the wing and where I was from, and you could kind of see that, hey, this thing works, and it works worldwide. And I really, really hope, I'm confident that it does, that continues in the Air Force today.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. What did you notice, or what observations did you have then of the things that people from those different communities brought to the training pipeline? I mean, so you talked about standardization a minute ago. You can go out, fly with anybody, and broadly speaking, it all comes together well, and everybody knows what everybody else is doing. There's some standardization there, but were there cultural differences? Were there inputs that you get from somebody who'd spent a couple of years in Kadena that you wouldn't get from somebody who'd spent a couple of years in Germany? What sort of things
Yes.
did you see?
Yeah. And some of it, I think you've covered very well in some previous episodes, but and you don't realize it at the time. I went to Langley because that was the assignment that was available, and off I go. But the guys that went out to Kadena definitely did, I think, they got more experience at large force employment than most of us stateside ever could have a chance to do. We went to our red flags, but that was every once in a while, and they did it much more frequently because of their exposure out in the Pacific and their abilities. The guys that came back from Europe, they, like me, really understood how to do alert. That wasn't something foreign to them. They understood that piece of it, and they also understood the impact of weather much more than probably the Kadena guys did or the stateside guys did. So yes, you're right. Each of those would bring those experiences in, and they would get shared. A lot of times they're getting shared in the bar on a Friday night, but it doesn't matter. You're hearing the stories, you're learning the lessons, and as appropriate, maybe they talk about it at a pilot meeting or a training session or something like that.
I remember talking to a guest of mine, Nick Forster, who was RAF Tornado pilot, and he had spent some time teaching fast young guys going through the fast jet training pipeline. And I remember asking him what sort of qualities he observed in the people who excelled And he had said that, that was a good question. And he used to do these sort of little exit interviews effectively, where he'd sit down with the most high performing students and say, "Tell me what you're doing. How do you make it? Well, how do you do to try and figure out what the formula is, if there is such a
Right.
for success?" What did you see as the characteristics of the high performing students? I mean, I'm guessing you saw a spread, even though you said all the
Sure.
guys, as time went on, the
Yeah.
guys got better and better, but you still see a spread.
Oh, absolutely.
What did you see? What made somebody great? What qualities made someone great? What qualities would cause someone to struggle?
Yeah. First off, your friend from the UK is way smarter than I. What a great idea. I wish I had done that. That was fantastic idea to absorb. But the easy one is preparation and attitude. The guys that all excel, they're pretty much always prepared. You don't find them where they're not prepared. That's an easy one. The attitude is one of open willingness to learn. No whining, no denying mistakes, anything like that. They do that well. And the one that's really ethereal that I can't give you a precise answer, but there are people on this planet that naturally have, I think, higher situational awareness when they're in the air than the other folks do. I would not put myself in that category. I had to kind of develop it and work on it, but I did meet folks. You go, how did he get just to that 3D understanding with this minimal amount of calm, and he can see that picture much clearer than the average pilot or the average student. And I don't know where that comes from, but I do know there's definitely some folks during the course of my career that I can think about and go, that guy had it. That was pretty easy to figure out. And the really good ones then become, instructors or patch wearers or whatever, and they're able to impart at least some of that ability to others or train others how to do it, even if they have to kind of power through it. But yeah, those are the key components that I could think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of the things that is similar to what he was saying is that the SA piece, there are just
Yeah,
his recollection was there are just some people who just know where they are in space and time, and they know what's coming next, and they know what's behind them, and they know what they've got to do next, and so even if that's not necessarily the same as SA in a furball, BFM, it's just
right.
the awareness of knowing what's coming up, and so that's very interesting. So, and what did you? I guess the obvious answer would be, well, if they didn't have those things, they'd struggle. But were there other things that you saw in students who struggled or who washed out that were common? That they had common amongst themselves in terms of the things that hindered them.
Yeah. Nothing jumps to mind in that you tend to kind of remember more of the folks that stayed with the program and graduated than you do the folks that maybe didn't make it through the whole thing. So nothing really jumps out. I will tell you that I think this was true for most of the IPs that I worked with at the 325th Fighter Wing at the time. If the guy or gal had a good attitude and worked hard, we would do whatever we could to get them through the program. There were very, very few, but occasionally I can think of kind of one, and I won't use obviously any names, who, if they don't have a good attitude, I don't have time for you. It's just not worth the investment. And the ones that we had, and I can speak this generally, is we had some folks that were transitioning from the F4 to the F-15. They were very high time F4 folks. They were not prepared, not physically. They weren't prepared mentally to kind of step back and say, there's a bunch of stuff out here that maybe this young captain knows about this airplane that I don't, but I'm not going to listen to him. That was the showstopper. But outside of that, most of the folks, they worked really hard to get there. You're not getting just a random selection. You're getting kind of a cream of the crop. And most of them, did at least reasonably well. But then that was a very unusual case. And I think it had to do more with, maybe the age of the individual. And just as we get older, it's a little harder to change. But, that was an unusual thing.
Did you see? So one of the things that I read, I don't remember where I read it, and I've asked a few guests about it, and they said that they haven't kind of seen it before. But I'm curious about it, and because you were an RTU guy, I want to ask you the question.
Mhm.
Did you see people going through the TX course? And it kind of relates to what you were just saying about F4 guys, who had lots of experience going to a new platform. But did you see experienced guys going through the TX course having problems? I think the thing that I read was about guys who would go and do their 3 or maybe even 6 years on the ground doing schools, doing
Mhm.
their A-lobe tour, whatever it is, and then they would get back to the jet, and then they would just not be quite sharp enough. They'd lost that edge, and they would fail the TX. They would fail to get back into the cockpit of a fast jet. Did you see that?
Not that I can remember. What I remember, both as an RTU, IP, and also being a TX student, there is nobody happier on the planet than a TX student because you've been doing this non-flying stuff. You're actually getting back into either, for some of the guys, because there was a weird program in the Air Force for a while where the guys coming off let's say the air staff would be rank ordered, and the number one guy could go to whatever airplane he wanted to. So he
Really?
might have grown up in the A-10 or the F-16 or something else. It had to be fighter to fighter, but he could come out of that thing, and he's the number one guy. I know a guy at NORAD who did that. He was a great guy. And so he goes, I've always wanted to fly the Eagle. Let's go do that. They're generally so happy, they're going to work real hard and they're going to do just fine. But that was just a little aberration in the assignment system at the time. For most of them, they are so happy to be back. The joke amongst my fellow TX guys when we were there was, when I die, I don't want to go to heaven. I want to go back to the Eagle TX course because it was just, we have no responsibilities. We're not writing OPRs, performance reports. We're not filling out paperwork. We study at night, we fly during the day, and we drink at the bar. Does it get any better than this? No, it really, really doesn't. It was wonderful. So I don't recall seeing a TX guy, the folks that I was talking about in that F-Force transition, that may have technically been some sort of a TX, but it was a long course. It was near B course in length because they'd never flown the Eagle. And they had never flown even like an F-16 or something very similar as far as performance and capability. But the TX guys coming back, no, they did fine. Yes, and it may take a ride or two, but you could see those glimmers of, not he screwed up, he didn't do particularly well, but you see in his eyes, he knows exactly what he didn't do right, and he's never going to do that again. Am I worried about him going out into the combat airforce? Of course not.
Hmm.
He's going to do just fine.
How many times were you a TX student?
Just once.
Just the once.
I when I finished my RTU stuff, I went to school, to a staff job at NORAD, came back as a TX, and then I was exceedingly fortunate. I flew from then until my retirement at 25 years service by doing back-to-back flying staff jobs, which is like unheard of. My timing was just good. I was lucky. I don't know, but it worked out. So I only had to do one TX course.
Okay, Shamu, we've only got a short amount of time left until
Sure.
I need to call knock it off. But just in the time that's remaining, then you said that RTU tour, the instructor tour at
Right.
Tindal was the best. I mean, obviously you've given us a sense of why that was, but is there anything else that really stands out for you that you want to share with us in terms of the memory that you have looking back that makes you feel that way?
It was just kind of a convergence of a bunch of different things where my ability in the Eagle really ramped up. So that was really, really neat to get very comfortable in the airplane. You're doing BFM, several times a week, week after week. So that was awesome. And you just developed some capabilities there. At the same time, we were able to have significant input into the future of the Eagle community with the simulators, with the syllabus, the changing culture with all these really neat weapons school guys that showed up there at that time. So that was kind of, I think, why I kind of view that, with a kind of a special time during my career. It does not dictate the neat things that I got to do in Alaska, which were phenomenal, or the things that even I did after that. No, those were very cool. But as you look back, you're like, that was kind of a neat time. And also, you're a young captain. You're flying your rear end off. You don't have all those other kind of adult responsibilities that you may have later on. That was just a neat place to be. The other thing that was kind of nice about it was that, like at the 48th, lots of folks were overseas boring holes in the sky in the early 90s, right? So we were given opportunities as RTU instructors that they normally did not get. They normally did not go to Red Flag. They normally did not do weapons school support or the roving sands exercise in New Mexico, and we did. So it was very common because our student load was lower because they were, lowering the number of pilots in the Air Force, always a stupid idea, but they were going through another cycle of stupid ideas as far as personnel management. But since that was happening, they didn't just dump IPs out the door and send them to the airlines. We got to take the airplanes and go do cool things. And if you have a 4-ship and the low time guy has 1,000 hours as an RTU instructor, you can be pretty darn good at some of these exercises, and it's a whole lot of fun. So that was, I think, why that time is kind of special in my mind.
Okay, so Shamu, we did talk before we hit record about the possibility of coming back and doing a part two, which we really have to do now because we still have to talk about. And here's a teaser: we have to talk about your F-16 ejection. We have to talk about your ground tour, and we have to talk then about the rest of your time flying Eagles, and of course specifically
Yeah,
around.
I think you also wanted to touch on Noble Eagle after the 9/11.
Indeed.
So we can definitely come back and do those things. It would be my pleasure. I sure appreciate your time and attention. And like I said, nice airplane behind you, even though that's not the tail that I flew. In that it's the same tail number. I flew that tail number, but by the time we took them, we rid of that tail flash, and we went to LY for Langley because everybody else has black letters, and we were a fighter squadron. We were not a other variety.
Okay, yeah, don't say it again. I think
No,
from this
too
episode,
expensive.
you didn't say dead bug, which was awesome, but you've said various other things that I'm sure you're going to get hammered on. So
I'll get in trouble for
yeah.
it. Yeah.
Okay, Shamu, awesome meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank
for
you,
your time.
Steve. Looking forward to next time.
Okay, we'll speak to you soon. Cheers.